We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeoanimals, the podcast about zooarchaeology. On this month's episode, we'll be looking at something a little bit different. We'll be looking at pathologies and what can we learn from animal disease in the archaeological record. With you, as always, Simona and my co-host,
Alex Fitzpatrick.
And thumbs up for the worst intro of the last 22 episodes, which is the entirety of them.
No, it's not that bad. I probably do worse. I don't know. I barely know what we're talking about, like, half the time on this podcast.
It's great for establishing that trust with listeners. It's like, oh, I'll listen to that podcast. They really know what they're on about. After they literally said on air, I'm not sure I know what I'm on about.
To be fair, that's actually a really good segue to our topic today because it's actually an incredibly understudied aspect of zooarchaeology, and that's pathologies, which I think a lot of people kind of always associate pathologies with like diseases and things like that. But at least when we talk about it archaeologically, it can also refer to physical injuries and trauma, stuff like that. It's just it's very hard, like everything else in zooarchaeology.
Unsurprising to no one.
No, nothing could be easy in archaeology, but it is useful. I mean, it's probably most useful because a lot of times it shows how a person or an animal died, or, you know, why the body was deposited there, all these kind of things that you can derive just from these, what could be, you know, really small little details or something horrific and awful to look at, you know, like rickets.
But yeah, like, and most important of all, so like gathering this information about ancient animals tells us more about how they interacted with humans and sort of what kind of relationship they had, whether it was a beloved pet or whether the animal was put to work, and if so, what kind of work, whether it was kept captured. Like, the options are endless. So just whatever the humans did with those animals, you might learn about it with pathology, or you may not. Because not all very little pathologies actually affect the bone. So chances are you won't know.
Yeah, that's like the funny thing is, like, if you can ID it, you know, that's amazing. You can learn so much from it. But because, you know, you're only dealing with bones for the most part, there's a really good chance you're not going to figure out all the pathologies that were associated with a body, especially with diseases, because not all diseases obviously affect bones. But when it comes to zooarchaeology, one of the interesting things about looking at specifically diseases and pathologies is, you know, how do hereditary pathologies get passed down to human influence? Because obviously, as we enter, you know, domestication, humans are influencing the breeding patterns of animals. It could be a functional thing, more of a cultural thing. It's a really interesting topic that has very little research done on it. I mean, not to say that there's no research done on it. There's a lot of books and stuff written about it. But like, if you compare it to human pathology, I think it's pretty understudied.
But in a way, it's kind of what it's... I don't mean to say that it's necessarily easier with humans, but of course with human osteology, you just have the one species to worry about.
Yeah,
with
exactly.
Animals, because different diseases will look different in different species.
Yeah.
Wow,
no.
So deep.
But it's true though, like, you know, you're not. It's not going to be a one-to-one transition. Obviously, some things will be very similar, especially if you're talking about trauma. You know, you break a leg on a pig, you break a leg on a human. It's going to kind of look the same.
But then there's a lot more going on with animals, and I guess one of the things that we don't have, as many comparative specimens for starters. Also the fact that humans have been looking after each other a lot longer than we've been looking after animals. So chances are, if the animal was really ill, it might have been cold before it started to show symptoms or started to show bone modification. It's not going to show up as much.
Wow, calling out humans for their speciesism.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bastard agrees.
Of course she does.
Yeah, true. But yeah, and also, I feel like someone told me this. I don't know if there's like actual evidence to back it up, but I mean, I would imagine it's true that you probably have more people who have studied, human anatomy outside of archaeology. So like people who may have been in medical fields and stuff like that coming into archaeology than veterinarian science people, No,
I see what you mean. I mean, probably.
I mean, we've got, in our department, we have someone who used to be a dentist who became an archaeologist and specializes in teeth, so...
Yeah, because I can't think of anyone who's sort of in animal management or veterinary science that sort of bridged the gap onto zooarchaeology. Or there may well be, and I'm grossly,
forgetting someone,
but...
I think it's more common for the opposite to happen, where people who have been in archaeology, but in zooarchaeology going towards, wildlife management and conservation things, because there's a whole movement of applied zooarchaeology, which kind of makes sense, I guess. There's probably, I don't know. I mean, this always makes me sound bitter, but zooarchaeology is so, underfunded and not respected like other parts of archaeology.
But it's also a case of again, for lack of a better term, making it more relevant. Because of zooarchaeology, I believe, is absolutely relevant. I'm doing a podcast about it. But finding ways to use the discipline to also make a change on the animals that are still alive and not just the ones that have died 2,000 years ago, is also something very important to be looking into.
Yeah, of course. I just like being better about it.
You do you.
I always do me. But yeah, so I don't know about you. I'm really not great at IDing pathologies on animal bone, other than like the really obvious stuff and some of the less obvious, I guess, but they're kind of more common, like tuberculosis. I vividly remember that that was our pathology lab when I was a master's student, is they just pulled out like a whole cow that had tuberculosis, which was fun. Arthritis, things like that, I can pinpoint disease-wise at least. What about you?
I'm not certain of how good I'd be to pinpoint the exact pathology sort of without consulting a source first. I like to think I'm all right of saying, yeah, that's pathology and not taphonomy, for instance.
Yeah, which we'll get into later, but I think I can at least do that. But yeah, no, especially because I'm in my department, I'm the only zooarchaeologist, and everyone else who at least works with bones, they're all human osteologists. So I always feel kind of like left out, because they're like, oh, look, you can see, the vitamin D deficiency in this person. And I'm like, I wish I could do that. I wish I could be really specific. That sounds fun. And they're like, Alex, what are you doing? And I'm like, I counted like 10 cows. Huge.
Well, that just comes down to your poor life choices.
I know. I'm still counting cows. It's very sad. But yeah, no, I mean, there is definitely some work. There's been a couple of like nice kind of general manuals out. More recently was the Shuffling Nags.
And Lame Ducks, and love the title.
Shuffling Nags and Lame Ducks. I love that title so much. Tag yourself. Are you a shuffling nag or a lame duck?
Pick one. Probably both at this rate.
Hashtag lame duck, hashtag shuffling nag. But yeah, no, it came out like a few years ago. It's so useful. But other than that, like there really isn't that much other than, every so often you have like a very specific case study or something like that. Because it's just like we were saying before, it is just really difficult. You don't really have the kind of comparable material available. But the nice thing is that at least when it comes to trauma, it's slightly more easy and more prevalent.
Yeah, that bone definitely broke. Yep, definitely broken, that bone. 100% broken.
Well, I mean, also because, we get more of like animals that were hunted and killed in some way. Obviously, it is like way more easy to pinpoint that kind of stuff. Because like my favorite example is we have this cow in our department, not a living cow, obviously.
Oh, shame.
I know. We have this, I think it's either a medieval or a Roman cow. I don't remember. Who cares? But it's a skull and it's got like a almost perfect circle in the skull because it would hit by a poleaxe.
Ah, them poleaxes.
Them poleaxes, yeah. I think about that all the time because that's how I feel. Hashtag big mood.
But I guess with pathology, much like ritual and archaeology, there's also the very simple sort of go-to thing. When there's a funky bone growth on this specimen you're looking at, when in doubt, chronic inflammation.
Ooh. Or if you're me, you just write bone growth.
Abnormal bone growth.
What's up with that? Oh gosh, I'm like in the middle of writing like my pathology stuff up for my PhD, and most of it is just like, yeah, weird bone growth. Do I know what it is? No. Just wanted to point it out. It's good.
This bone doesn't look the way it's meant to look like.
Hey, why did it look like that? I don't know. You tell me.
Chronic inflammation / infection.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm more partial to fractures / healed fractures, because those are like, when you get like a healed fracture on a rib, man, you can really pinpoint those because they are slightly funky looking, but not too funky looking.
I think we mentioned on the sort of like the wild sort of hunted animals episode about so that photo that was making its round on the interwebs of that deer that had bone growth around this arrow. Clearly had been shot by an arrow, survived, and the bone grew around it.
Yeah.
Which is a thing.
No,
cool.
I mean...
Not cool for the deer. I'm surely what you was most uncool for the deer.
I'm just thinking about how I wish pathology was that easy.
Yep, definitely arrow. I can tell you this bone is fractured. I can also tell you what's done it.
But yeah, I think the kind of unusual stuff, those bone growths and things, I think that's basically what we kind of like lean towards when it comes to IDing pathologies. Like I was saying, I'm very partial to healed fractures. I don't know why. It's just, I think they're just really cool in seeing something that had actually healed on something that's dead. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's cool, and also in a very unsettling way.
Yeah,
well.
like super morbid.
A lot of healed fractures in animals as well as in humans. A good chunk of the time, sort of historically, they grow back in very weird ways.
Oh yeah, there was I was working on a thing, like an assemblage that had a chicken bone that had healed, but it healed like really weird, like almost, it wasn't a complete 90-degree angle, but it was close enough that I was kind of upset about it.
Ouch.
Yeah, that's when earlier in this episode, I mentioned rickets, and it's only because that's the one thing that really stuck with me. I took an osteology class, human osteology class, and our lecturer pulled out all the pathology bones she had, and one of them was rickets on a femur, I believe, and it was like literally a 90-degree angle, and that has haunted me ever since. It's been like almost 5 years.
Yeah, because I think with things like that related to animals, I mean, it was either a case that humans wouldn't do much about it, but even like, depending on which sort of time period you're looking at, they wouldn't necessarily even be sure what to do about it.
True, yeah, exactly.
Like my chicken's broken its leg. Like, do I put 2 twigs against it? What do I do?
But I guess that's also... talking about healing, that's also really interesting because it tells you a bit about, this, especially when you get deep into the past, this animal must have been probably cared for because there's no way it would have lived this long with this injury. And that's what...
It's something really debilitating, because sometimes, you'd be surprised what animals in the wild can survive.
Yeah, true.
You see the deer with the arrow in the chest.
Yeah.
But also to a point, it implies some degree of care. I mean, either because we can't really infer on the reason, because it could be, and I really care about that chicken, or just because, I can't afford to get another chicken. I mean, I could eat it, but it would probably be better for me if I just keep on taking the eggs every day. So I can't really afford to lose a chicken. So I'm going to look after it, I guess.
I mean, either way, that still shows significance.
Yes, I guess we can reconstruct the action, but not necessarily the
intention,
the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
Unless you're dealing with Roman stuff, and they've probably written about it in their diary or something.
We haven't even really brought up the Romans, and you had to bring it up, huh?
The Romans and ritual, and it's only part one.
Yeah. Shout out to the listener who promised us free coffee for a week if we didn't mention ritual. I was gonna.
Yeah, that's just cheating, though.
Yeah, I was gonna try for the record.
Well, then we'll just let it apply to Alex.
Yeah, I can do more coffee. Are there any Roman taxes you want to talk about that relate to pathology?
Yeah, like that notorious fine that you'd get if you not look after your chicken after it broke its leg.
That I don't know much about Romans, so that could 100% be a real thing. You can't do this to me. You already tricked me by trying to make me believe crows didn't exist in this country. And
you almost fell for it.
I'm a very simple person.
And while we dwell on this simplicity, we shall take a break and be back with you shortly.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ANIMALS. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
And we're back with part 2 of this month's episode on paleopathology.
Yeah, and now we're going to complain for the rest of this segment.
Have you eaten at least?
Had some wine. Does that count?
Does it count, dear listeners? Please tweet at us at Archaeoanimals. Does wine count as food?
Hashtag wine meal. I don't know. I'm not very good at making hashtags.
Chunky
anyway,
wine?
Chunky wine. Oh, man, love a chunky wine right now.
But I think, as we mentioned in part 1, the issue sort of with paleopathology within zooarchaeology is that it's compared to human osteology, is sort of a bit less research and looked into. Because part of the reason why is that we don't tend to have as much comparative material than you would sort of in human osteology.
Yeah. And the other reason is because it can actually be really difficult to differentiate between pathologies and other kind of taphonomic marks. Wow.
Because
I got it.
Yes, you've got this, Alex. Or Alec, apparently, because that's your name now.
I misspelled my name once. Ugh.
But yes, and by taphonomy, of course, we mean sort of all the factors that sort of took place after death, or sort of after, more usually after deposition. So you have, I don't know, remains being moved or just again modified after death, whether it's for butchery, cooking, working, and ultimately when they've been deposited.
Yeah, like if someone just chucks it down a ravine or something. All taphonomy.
Well, like if they are waterlogged, of course that will change its appearance in terms of color. Usually waterlogged bones tend to go much darker, if not completely black. Not to be confused with bones that have been charred, which are also black, just to be helpful.
Well, super waterlogged bone will also just kind of completely fall apart depending on what you're dealing with. We refer to the really badly water damaged bone on our site as cheesy bone. Because I still don't really understand it. It's Lindsay Booster, who's like one of our directors of the project, and yes, I am calling her out on this podcast. She refers to it as cheesy bone, which I thought was charming, but I still don't really understand why.
Well, because I guess in a way it wouldn't be the water per se that does the damage to the bone. It's just, of course, it creates that anaerobic environment. So then when you excavate it and you disturb it, that's when it becomes cottage cheese.
It's God.
Hopefully without the smell, even though waterlogged deposits are kind of smelly.
Yeah, no. Luckily, this doesn't have smell. But like, I just got a bag of them, and I like picked them up and went to wash them off, and they just crumbled my hand, and I was like, well,
90% gravity.
It's fine. That is me.
I guess
that was 90% gravity.
I guess one of the more common sort of taphonomic marks that you do tend to get on bones, like have you ever noticed those little, again, technical term, those little squiggles all over the surface of the bone? So you think like sometimes like depending on how deep the grooves are, you'll be like, oh, is that working? Is that some sort of a bone loss? Nope, that be roots. That's rooting damage.
Root marks are the worst thing. I actually had a gorgeous crane tibia tarsus that was like really like well preserved and everything. It was amazing. I was so like happy. It was in like a specific part of the cave, so it was like, oh, this is like a huge thing. And then I saw that there were like grooves on it, and I was so hyped for it. I was so excited. I was like, oh my God, it was worked. It wasn't even roots. That's the worst part. It was apparently the blood vessels in the legs of birds can sometimes get really like wrapped tight around the bone that it leaves an impression.
Okay, well, you see that like with some tibias. You do see that in tibias, where the blood vessels, so it leaves little grooves. And of course, if you're familiar with it, you know exactly what it is. But to the uninitiated, it'll be like, oh, what's this? Is it cool? No, it's absolutely 100% uncool.
Yeah, it's a giant bummer. I was so ready to like write my nature paper on amazing crane cults in the past, but no.
You get that sometimes as well with, I guess that counts as taphonomy as well, gnawing.
Yeah.
Or gnawing or chew, it's not chew, but bite marks. You get that, so sometimes like it removes quite a lot of the bone off, and you think like at first glance it might be, oh, like that's some severe bone loss. Oh no, a dog has been chewing on it.
And dogs are so much worse because their saliva ends up kind of almost polishing the bone, so it really looks nice and worked, and you're like, oh no, this is just a dog's chew toy.
Still cool.
It's nice though. Yeah, no, I've got some nice astragalus bones that have been chewed up, and they're like nice and polished and full of holes.
Oh, it looks like a Fido went through someone's dice set.
Yeah. Cheesy bone. Anyway, so yeah. Yeah, no, now I am glad that I've now put that cursed image of cheesy bone into everyone's brain. You are all lucky that I don't have an image of it, because I would 100% have put it in the show notes. But it was too depressing to look at, so I didn't take a picture. But yeah, cheesy bone. Now you know about cheesy bone. But yeah, so pathologies and taphonomy can really, conflict with each other and make it like such a pain to like have to go through and like, especially if it's taphonomy or if it's pathology that might be really interesting and really vital to whatever you're researching, and you really have to like end up looking hard and trying to like almost like work backwards. Like, okay, so this is probably post-mortem taphonomy or something. This is actually pathology that happened while I was still alive or something like that. It's a lot. It's a lot of detective work, I guess.
Because of course, like some of the more obvious things, like say a fracture that's been healed all wrong, that will jump to you.
Yeah.
But a lot of what you tend to deal with is a lot more subtle than that. You don't usually get sort of the very grim looking specimens, if that makes sense. So I guess then the thing that I guess is worth pointing out as well at this stage about pathology, sort of what we mean by that on the bones is that sort of a disease, and again, presuming it's a disease that does affect the bone, as bone reacting in very simplistic terms, just two different ways. So if bone is put under stress, it either creates more bone or it subtracts bone.
Yeah, it's just, it can be so frustrating. And, you know, you have your perimortem trauma and postmortem trauma, which, to be honest, I am not great at figuring out sometimes. Was this bone broken before or after death? Which sounds like a silly question, but when you're talking about, you know, is this a bone that was broken and just never necessarily healed properly? Or was this a bone that broke and, like, they died?
Yeah, because I think, like, pre-mortem is probably going to be the easiest to identify. Because, of course, if it's pre-mortem, as in, like, some time before death, then you're going to see signs of healing. Now, with perimortem, so at the time, around the time of death, and post-mortem, it becomes a little bit more difficult because, of course, if the insult to the organism or the trauma, that is a proper term, the insult to the organism, if it happened either around the time of death or soon after death, neither are really going to show signs of healing.
Yeah.
So it'll be difficult to tell for sure whether it happened around the time of death or at death itself or after death. I guess the only thing with post-mortem trauma, it becomes a lot more obvious when it's really post-mortem, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
the bones that, if it's sort of perimortem or right after the animal passed, and say the femur was broken, and because a lot of the organic content is still there, it's going to break very differently from when 2,000 years later you dig it up, gravity happens, and you just sort of whack it with a mattock.
Yeah, you know, it's definitely different when, you know, it's 2014 and you're troweling like you were just taught to do, and then you're like, oh my God, is that a bone? And then you keep troweling, and then it just shatters into a million pieces.
A million pieces, everyone.
Yeah, and then you kind of shift it to the side and hope people notice it.
The curse of the cheesy bone.
That wasn't even cheesy bone. Like, I'm just really strong, apparently, and broke right through that, like, cortical bone.
Oh, no. It happens.
Yeah, it happens. And then the other thing, speaking, I guess, of cheesy bone, although that's more of an extreme, is, you know, like weathering. Just simple weathering can really look like disease and vice versa. Like, depending on the kind of site you're working on, like, I've definitely worked on some bones that had like severe weathering, but also a bit of pathology on it. Like, and it's just, you just throw your hands up at that point, really. And you say, a lot of stuff's going on this bone.
Because especially, like, it's very site dependent. If you have really good preservation, then life is going to be a lot easier for you. But then if you go on a site, so say it's got very acidic soil, which are not very conducive to bone preservation.
Nope.
So you find a collection of cheesy bones.
Wow, you love that phrase.
I can't stop.
I'm gonna have to tell Lindsay to trademark it as soon as possible.
It's a good term.
It's a great term. I still necessarily I don't understand how that term came to be. I'll have to ask her. Maybe we'll have to interview her on this podcast just about cheesy bone.
Maybe some of the research as well, not just.
Nah, it's fine. We are only talking about. Me and Lindsay are working on the same thing, so we can just talk about cheesy bone.
If you must.
The fascinating world of cheesy bone.
Yes, moving on. Look, as we mentioned earlier as well, another issue with pathology is that, of course, there's only a limited amount of diseases that do actually affect the bone. Mm-hmm. So that's something like tuberculosis will affect the bone, or rickets, arthritis, my beloved chronic inflammation / infection. That'll affect the bone. If you flat out break it, well, that's going to show.
Yeah. You get an arrow through it, that's going to show.
I guess, is it, I can't remember what the exact term is, but sort of the musculoskeletal. So when you have an excessive bone growth forming from sort of repeated RSIs, like repetitive strain injuries.
Oh, gosh.
So when you keep making the same movement time and time again, it will show on the bone. Because I think that is sort of tentatively being used in human osteology to sort of get a vague idea of occupation.
Yeah, we definitely, I've seen it the very few times that I've worked on human bone. That's definitely one of the things you look out for, especially like, looking at patellas that have been like extremely pathological issues going on there. You can really see the difference between someone who's doing a specific type of hard labor from someone who, isn't. And I guess that can be tricky with animals, depending on what kind of animals you're looking at.
In all fairness, it's tricky with people as well, because a lot of different professions will show very similar marks on the bone.
True, yeah, exactly.
So I guess if they looked at my skeleton 2,000 years from now, and probably see sort of signs, I don't know, say of I'm right-handed, so they'll probably see, like a lot of bone growth on my right side.
Yeah.
And they probably think, like a farm laborer. Like, no.
I mean, have you seen your garden? You're kind of close.
Yeah, I suppose.
And then they'll look at my skeleton and they'll be like, wow, this person stayed inside most of the time. Huh. It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
That vitamin D deficiency again, that you mentioned earlier.
But yeah, no, and of course, that's also why this is a slightly under-researched area, or not necessarily under-researched, but an area that is still a little bit, not an exact science for us, because there's so many pathologies that aren't necessarily going to show up on your bone. And also, I think that's one of the reasons why we can't just say like, let's turn to veterinary science for this, because a lot of the stuff that we see as someone who's working on deceased or very deceased animals isn't necessarily what veterinarians are going to see in terms of like, pathologies.
No, but they'll still be like a good point of reference.
True, yeah, exactly.
As well as farmers, I believe, as well, because of course they manage sort of livestock day in and day out, and they've had to probably deal with their fair share of pathologies and issues with their livestock. So I think farmers probably also have a lot to contribute to the field.
We should get more farmers to work with us.
I'll tell you, like they probably have a better clue, well, definitely than myself.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I've read up on farming stuff and also butchery stuff for my zooarchaeological research. So if you're a butcher or a farmer, please come into zooarchaeology. We need you desperately.
Experimental work is great.
Yeah.
And of course, like I do firmly believe, of course, I'll be looking sort of at vets, farmers, and like butchers for zooarchaeology. But as with any discipline, so someone who's in the trade,
yeah,
is invaluable. So if you're researching ceramics, then sort of talking things out with an actual sort of present day potter, you've probably got a lot to learn.
Yeah. No, exactly.
About what would work, what wouldn't work. Like, we're going back to zooarchaeology, like, could this be a butchery of this particular animal? And then a butcher can explain to you why that wouldn't work. And then you can create all the weird and wonderful theories you like, but that, from a utilitarian point of view, would not work.
Because a lot of the utilitarian reasonings behind things hasn't changed at all, despite, how old a lot of the stuff that we work on are. There are those certain cuts that are like the cuts that butchers want to make are going to be more or less the same from back then, farmers who work with who are still working with livestock. For the most part, a lot of it hasn't changed. They'll probably still see the same kind of things. So you're right in that kind of trade knowledge is super important. Also, experimental zooarchaeology is probably super delicious. So,
but all in all, basically, just give pathology some love. Well, no, that sounds wrong. Give the field of paleopathology some love, because it is very useful, and if we have better ways of confidently IDing pathological specimens, they can actually tell us an awful lot about past relationships between humans and animals.
Exactly, yeah. And I think we'll get into that a bit more when we get to our next segment for the case studies. But for now, we are going to take a break.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
And we're back, and we're talking about plague and death in this wonderful episode of Archaeoanimals. So, as with every Archaeoanimals episode, this final segment is always about case studies, and actually, as a producer, it's one of my favorite parts of the episode. We take all the things that we've been talking about, all the topics, and all the little bits of information, and it's now time to put it in context and look at examples from the real world. So without much further ado from myself, take it away, Alex and Simona.
Well, the funny thing is that it was actually kind of difficult to find case studies for this episode because, again, it's a bit of an understudied field, not necessarily one that you get very specific cases for. But I did my best, I think. Maybe.
You did good.
I don't know. Thank you. Please reaffirm me. Thank you. Anyway, let's instead of kind of like specific case studies, I thought it might be good to kind of focus on specific types of pathologies that we find in the fields. So one of them is from research that has been being done in the Balkans, specifically Neolithic Western Balkan sites, and it's looking at animals and work. And I feel like we probably talked about this because we talked about domestication a lot, I think.
Yes, I think some of the pathologies that we'll be mentioning have definitely been covered in our cow episode.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, there's just to maybe say it again, if there's any new listeners around whatever, there is a connection between domesticated species and pathologies. Basically, depending on the kind of pathology we have, we might be able to kind of suss out, how these animals, one, if these animals were domesticated, and two, how exactly they were worked. So the example here would be cattle for traction in prehistoric Europe. So for those who don't know, traction is mostly kind of associated with plowing and cart pulling. Research that's being done in the Western Balkans refers to it more as a specialization of certain animals, where you have light traction, which is more of an occasional use of the animal in that way, or heavy traction, which is a very consistent use.
I guess what that does to the bone, it usually leads to bone growth.
Yeah.
So, of course, all this stress and injury that is put especially on the feet will result in bone remodeling. Mm-hmm. So one of the sort of more well-known cases in cattle is spavin, which again affects the bones of the feet, and that's usually associated with traction, which, of course, around this part of the world took place in the prehistoric period all the way up to the Industrial Revolution, really. And I think some parts of Europe as well are going back to using cattle for traction. So I think I was reading about an example for Italy, I believe it was somewhere in Italy, where there's some land that is particularly hard to work on because it's so wet that if you were to track vehicles on it, you just end up with massive ruts. It's essentially next to unworkable.
Oh, okay.
So they've resorted... No, I got it entirely wrong. It's it's here in the UK. I'm gonna have to try and find it and mention it on the show notes. But they're using horses for traction. It is like for those reasons. Like it's you wouldn't really be able to track vehicles on it, So they're using sort of a rare, sort of large breed of horse for traction.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, no, that's actually really interesting. And to be fair, like, even though the specific case that we're talking about is about cattle, horses were obviously used as for traction as well. And that's actually, when I read this for the case studies bit, that's actually my immediate association with pathologies and domesticated animals is depending on what tools you use. So like harnesses and bits, for example, you get that uneven wear in teeth, specifically in horses quite frequently. And I feel like that's like the example of that kind of pathology that I always run into.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly common one. I think that you see it mostly in horse.
Yeah.
That sort of uneven wear sort of around the premolars / molars. Although you can get that as well in other species, though that's not necessarily linked to them being worked, but sometimes if they're kept sort of in cramped conditions or in cages and they bite on the bars.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think about that.
And that can also lead to sort of this abnormal wear of only like a portion of the teeth. Because, of course, if you have like all the entire dentition is sort of consistently worn down, because they'll be indicative of age and diet more than anything. But of course, when you have some teeth that are not very worn and you have like the 2 premolars that are just completely worn, then you know that there's something pathological going on there.
Personally, I think dental pathologies is the one thing that really like squirks me out. Like, ugh. You
just don't like teeth. I really like teeth.
I mean, yeah, no, I don't really like teeth. And I think this is, to be fair, I also think this is more of a case with human pathologies. Like, you find a tooth that's got an abscess in it, and you're just like, maybe I also, because I don't like the dentist. So.
It's a trend that I've seen mostly, like, not among zooarchaeologists. I find that a lot of human osteologists really don't like teeth. But I guess I can see like you're more easily, because they would, of course, look exactly like your own, so you're more inclined to go, eh.
And I think it's also very, like, it's a kind of pain that, like, almost everyone experiences at some point in their life. So if you find, like, a skull with, like, some really bad dental pathologies, like, I saw one that basically had the same kind of cavities I had, and just... No,
of course, personally, I really like teeth because, of course, they're usually incredibly diagnostic.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
To pinpoint them exactly what tooth it is, which side, whether it's upper or lower, the species, like you name it. Teeth are easy. They're cool. And in terms of pathology, of course, while we've gone down this rabbit hole of periodontal disease, that's also a relatively easy one to identify in animals.
Yeah.
One that springs to mind, and of course, applies to animals, but of course, it also applies to humans. When you get tooth resorption, so something you'll find in the jaw, the maxilla. Yeah. So when you lose a tooth, of course, if it's pre-mortem, that is, of course, the first thing that your bone will do is start remodeling and cover the exposed cavity until that's completely healed up. Mm-hmm. So, of course, you'll see, in an older animal, provided that, of course, it's lived to a very long age and is in some way or another being looked after, you'll see sort of like tooth loss, and then that's with the bone that's remodeled over that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and that brings us into our next case study pretty well. So we have this previous case study that we just talked about, which is kind of, research on pathologies in these kind of domestic animals can really show the variety within work-related pathologies, and how if we really take a good look at them, we can maybe differentiate a bit more between like what type of animals are doing what type of jobs, which animals are being raised for this specific job, which is really interesting. And then kind of on maybe not the opposite extreme, but I guess in a way it kind of is, we have care. So a lot of this episode has been us talking about, this animal had this disease or this kind of injury or something like that. But also seeing that these kind of things were healed and that these kind of animals live with these pathologies can reveal a lot about the way we care. And unsurprisingly, this is about Roman dogs.
For once, she brings it up.
Well, I mean, I was throwing a bone to you. Hashtag Simona's Romans.
But I guess sort of dogs in the Roman period, a prime example of how these domesticates would live way past what would have been the normal lifespan in the wild because of some form or another of care, whether it's just the mere keeping it alive or whether it's an intentional sort of caring, for the animal. I mean, as I said earlier, we cannot make an informed statement on the reasoning behind. You can only look at the evidence of what we've got. One thing, so like a survey that has been carried out of dog remains from Roman sites show a number of pathologies found in their remains, sort of from like periodontal disease to arthritis, healed fractures, and of course these could be indicative of both care and lack thereof.
Yeah.
Because some with the healed fractures, it might be a dog that's hurt his leg and a humans look after them. It might be a dog where someone intentionally broke their leg, for all we know.
That's sad.
Which, unfortunately, it's a thing that happens today, so I'm sure has always happened since time immemorial.
Yeah, and obviously research also shows that you have an increase in pathological issues with age in Roman dogs, which, I mean, kind of makes sense. But also the research that we're talking about specifically cites how smaller toy breeds, which I was kind of surprised had already existed at this point or was like in the process of becoming a bit more popular, would have multiple conditions. So they would need a higher amount of care. So one example was that one dog had lost most of its teeth and had a really high amount of deformation on its jaws. So the only way it would be able to survive is it would have to be like hand fed by humans.
Yeah, because I guess a fair amount of that would be due to old age as well. But then I wonder how much of that would also be due to the breeding pool.
Yeah, that's what I was
thinking. Had, because of course, if you have a very small pool of dogs and you keep interbreeding them with each other, that's going to cause an issue. But of course, a lot of the pathologies can be informed by diet as well.
Yeah.
So I guess in terms of in that particular case of that dog with sort of the demineralized jawbone, that might be due to very meat-rich meals. Mm-hmm. Although I think what we find more often, we do tend to find sort of cavities and periodontal disease in dogs as well as cats, although cats much more recently so. And of course, it's something that, like cavities, which are usually caused, by very starchy, sugary foods, is something that an omnivore that is more on the carnivore side of life, really, and a hypercarnivore really should not be having. So that comes down to the diet that was given by humans. So say if the Romans kept these dogs around and they would just feed them leftovers and throw the odd bit of bread at them, they would end up with periodontal disease, which would not really happen in the wild, unless they're scavenging, that is.
Yeah.
But I guess especially with cats, you don't really see periodontal disease, we'll say, like in farm cats, because they just sort of they wander around and eat rats.
Yeah, and again, it's just an example of the kind of broader theme that zooarchaeology really deals with, which is the human influence on these animals, whether that's just, something like domestication, or even if it's just kind of like care or how they treat these animals. There's so much you can learn from that. And completely unrelated to talking about diet and pathology, but when you read about the smaller toy breeds in the show notes, was there a specific kind of modern dog that you thought of?
Pick one.
Because I was picturing Roman Chihuahuas.
I kind of was as well.
What about Roman Pugs?
A Chihuahua/pug.
Yay!
No? Roman Pugs? Like, I would love a Roman Pug. Like in the way you like it. Go to the wee hat, honestly.
I mean, I would love a Roman Pug. Yeah.
Go to the wee hat.
Was it like a pug that lectures you about stuff like Pliny?
No, like
new conspiracy theory. Pliny was actually a pug.
Probably wouldn't have lived as long as he has if he'd been
Pliny
a pug.
the pug.
Ah! Can that be the mascot of the podcast now?
A pug called Pliny.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Pug in Roman costume. It'll be on the internet. Pug in Roman costume.
Oh god.
Oh my god.
What is this show?
Oh my god, there's more than one.
Oh, no. What a time to be alive.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Wow, this should have been a case study on its own. I'm kind of sad that we're doing this the last couple minutes of the podcast.
No. You have to see this. I want your reaction to this.
Okay. This. All right, folks. This is live reactions to an image. I mean, I guess we'll have to put that in the show notes.
There are so many of them.
Oh,
amazing.
I love it.
Oh, there's another one? Oh, no. Oh, no.
This is the thing. So, obviously...
We miss out on all this fun stuff.
It's almost sad to think that the Romans never had pugs.
I don't know. I'm kind of glad they didn't.
Yeah,
I know,
it's very sad.
We kind of messed up dog breeds. We mentioned that in the dog episode, didn't we?
Yes, you might say so. Although you see now there's some pugs, I think, that are being bred, so they're reverting them back to what they used to look like at the start of the 20th century. Because you find like a lot of the breeds, it's really only the last 100 years, like with German shepherds or bulldogs, that have sort of been bred to a very sort of really make some traits look really extreme.
Sorry, I can't stop looking at this pug.
But
This is the best thing I've seen.
I think it does kind of like add to that kind of idea of like animals that were looked after past the point that you might naturally think they might have, passed away. I think that kind of those kind of examples, when we see them, it's really, really, really fascinating, because I think a lot of people don't really link, behavior to bones. A lot of people in the general public don't really link what we can infer from certain like bones and the pathologies of bones as to what actually happened. So I think that's a really cool example.
I think this pug cured my depression. I can't stop looking at it. I've literally kind of tuned out on the rest of the podcast. I'm just looking at this pug.
Simona, why don't you bring it back?
No, but with care, like, you still see it sort of present day. Where, like, if you look at the lifespan of cats and dogs today, it by far exceeds what it used to be even 30 years ago.
Mm.
So I think the care does quite considerably extend the lifespan of an animal. So we see that in present day, but that was also the case in archaeological cases. I forgot how to English. I'm just I'm entranced by the
Yeah,
pug.
no, this ruined me. As long as I think about for the rest of my life is his pug.
Well, don't worry.
Not even dinner.
We
just
will
the pug.
include it in the show notes.
Oh no, I already put it in the show notes.
All right. Shall we wrap this up? Like one should be wrapped up if they're not feeling well? See what I'm doing there? I'm tying it in.
I'm wrapped up like I'm not feeling well, but that's because I like being cozy.
Oh, fair enough. I
I
don't
live
mind
a cozy
it
life.
cold.
I'm in a dressing gown.
Well, I think that was a episode. As always, follow us on Twitter at archaeoanimals. Find us on the Archaeology Podcast Network website, or subscribe and tell your friends about us. All the other fun stuff. I don't know, what else do we say at the end of these things?
And tell your pugs about it.
Yeah, if you have any more Roman pugs, please send us more pictures.
Or if you have a Roman costume for dogs, please send it for Sandy.
True. Yes. Please help us.
No, bastard. She doesn't take to fancy costume very kindly. She'd probably curse you.
Yeah, fair enough.
Remember, you guys, use the hashtags #Simona's Romans and #Roman Pugs for this episode.
Yes, please.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Archaeoanimals. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. You can find us on Twitter at Archaeoanimals. Also, the views expressed on the podcast are those of ourselves, the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily represent those of our institution, employers, and the Archaeology Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.